There we go. Good afternoon, Canada, people across Canada. Welcome to another Ecofiscal Hangout. Today we are going to talk about how best Canada can reduce its transportation emissions, its GHG emissions in the transportation sector. My name is Chris Reagan. I'm a professor of economics at McGill University, and I'm also chair of Canada's Ecofiscal Commission. And before we get into the real topic, I just want to let you know, in case you hadn't seen it, that a couple of weeks ago, the Ecofiscal Commission released a new report called Course Correction, and it's a paper about Canada's provincial and federal policies that are encouraging the production and the use of biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel. And our report is about those policies and about the extent to which they have been effective at reducing emissions, but also the cost associated with reducing those emissions. The answer is they have been effective, but they've been very costly, and we recommend that those policies come to an end. Now, biofuel policies and biofuels are just a very small piece of the bigger question about how to reduce transportation emissions, and emissions in the transportation sector are just a little piece of the bigger picture of how to reduce emissions overall in the Canadian economy. So I'm delighted today to have two experts to talk about this with me and to talk with each other. We hope to get a good discussion and debate going. Mark Jaccard is a professor of Energy and Materials Research Group at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. He was named a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2009 and BC's Academic of the Year in 2008. I don't think Quebec has that, but that'd be a cool thing to win. And in 2006, he wrote this book, which I quite enjoyed, Sustainable Fossil Fuels. It won the Donner Prize for the top policy book in Canada. So just take a look at that title, Sustainable Fossil Fuels. You got to wonder how to square that circle. Well, Mark's going to tell us about that. Diane Zimmerman is the Program Director of Transportation and Urban Solutions Program in Ontario with the Pembina Institute. So Pembina Institute, which is across the country. Prior to joining the Pembina Institute, she worked for Suncor Energy, supporting their climate change action plan. So Mark and Diane, thank you very much for joining me today. We are looking forward to this discussion. I'm going to start by asking you each for a 3-minute introduction of your views on the issue. And you get to kind of define the issue, whether it's reducing emissions in transportation, how to do it, how not to do it, why to do it. Give us your 3-minute perspective, not too much detail. After we get 3 minutes from each of you, we will then go into some more pointed questions, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. Before you give me your 3 minutes, let me just say to people out there watching this that you can send your questions into us. We've already received a bunch of questions by email, but you can send further questions into us using hashtag ecofiscal or hashtag transportation, or you can send them by email at info@ecofiscal.ca. So send those questions in and send them in as the thing progresses. Diane, why don't we start with you for your 3-minute spiel?
Sure, wonderful. Thank you for the introduction. I just really at the Pembina Institute, we're very much focused on looking at the transportation sector. It is Canada's second largest with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, and it is closely linked to Canada's largest sector, and that's with oil and gas. And so how we create the fuels and bring them downstream is of great importance to us. We think that you need to look at both demand and supply side management and opportunities. While we think it's a great challenge, we continue to have a heavy reliance on personal automobiles, and a big part of our Canadian economy relies on how we move our goods. And so looking at the emissions associated with the freight sector will definitely change the emissions profile of how we go forward. And I think that we are very interested in looking at low carbon fuel standards and also fuel efficiency and demand side opportunities, so we can look at shifting ourselves out of personal vehicles and into other forms of mobility around transit, active transportation, walking, things like that.
Perfect. Thank you, Diane. You've hit on, it's interesting, having looked at the questions that have come in already, you've hit on a bunch of them. Transportation sector linked to oil and gas in terms of production and delivery, demand and supply side measures. Personal reliance on automobiles comes up quite a lot in our questions, and so how to break that link, or even, if that's desirable. But also trade. Canada is a trading nation, and the need to get our goods to market and to bring goods from the rest of the world, and how does that link to transportation and fuel efficiency and all this. So all kinds of great stuff. Thank you. Lots to dig into there. Mark, what's your 3-minute spiel?
I am, at the end of the day, an energy environment economist, and the research that I've been involved in over a couple of decades has been to sort of be very careful about deciding that this is how human beings will react to a challenge like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whether in transportation or any other sector. So we come at it with our own idea of what's good for people. An example would be, so maybe we can have some discussion about this, is to get people out of the personal automobile. And my own research, and with a lot of other people around the world, suggests that it could well be that humanity will move fairly dramatically to get to near zero emissions in transportation, or over, 2.5, 4.5 decades. And if and I'm saying it would do that, but if it did, that we might be using cars more than ever. We might have road pricing or other things, but actually the car is a fantastic thing as a personal mobility device. And so the point there is that I tend to like pricing mechanisms because they give the greatest flexibility for people to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to not have a car anymore, or are they going to do something else? Of course, we need public sector engagement if we're going to have transit and other options for people, but I think we have to be careful to think we're getting people out of cars. And in that regard, Chris, you mentioned your eco-fiscal report, and its basic message was, in my view, was we should try to get close to pricing type policies. And what I liked about it is that it said that's a concern, but it also said at the same time, if there are political constraints on climate policy is difficult, then maybe we should look at other kinds of policies of a regulatory nature even. But when we're doing that, we should really be trying to focus on how can we do it so they're economically efficient. And that's kind of the challenge you throw out in that recent eco-fiscal report. And so I liked it. So there's my opening.
Good, thank you. So, I mean, it's interesting. I listened to you as an economist describe why you like pricing, because, you want people and companies, right, businesses and households, to make their own choices. And it just struck me as I was listening to you say that, which I agree with, that, it's one more example of how economists are not normal people, because economists really put value on this idea that, in response to the market prices, people will make choices, and different people with different preferences, different technologies, different business situations will make different choices. But non-economists put a lot less weight on that point, right? They think that we as policymakers can know better, can know what's good for people, to know how to do things. So and that does come up clearly as a tension between pricing policies and other types of policies. Okay. So thank you very much. Let me ask the first big question, which is, look at the title of this session, right? The title of this hangout is, how do we best reduce emissions in the transportation sector? So a couple of assumptions there. Number one, there seems to be an assumption that reducing emissions is good. There seems to be this concept of best. So what does best mean? But also we're asking specifically about reducing emissions in the transportation sector. So my first question is the title of this session wrong? Like, should we just be thinking about reducing emissions? Or does it actually make sense, which would include the transportation sector, but also all other sectors? Or does it actually make sense to put specific emphasis on the transportation sector? So the transportation sector is about 30% of Canada's total emissions. If you look at just the stuff that's on roads, it's about 20% of total emissions. I mean, so those are big numbers. So what is the argument for why we need to look specially at transportation? I'll start with Diane again.
Sure.
and maybe your answer, by the way, is we don't have to, but whatever your answer is.
No, I think that we definitely need to look at the transportation emissions specific policies. I think I applaud the federal government for introducing the carbon pricing, and think that that is an important first step for us to move forward. But I think that when you're looking at transportation opportunities, I think we're going to need to marry that with other forms of policies, not just carbon pricing, but look at fuel efficiency regulations, look at greenhouse gas regulations, and also you know, when you look at, you bring it down from a macro level down to a micro level, you know, we really need to work with municipalities and the provincial government to help determine how we are planning our cities. How are we sharing the road network, whether it's by cars or transit or freight or bicycles. And so I think that we're going to need a suite of options.
Okay, so let me push back a little bit on that, and I'll ask you, I'll go to Mark, but I'll ask Diane to come back, you know, to address my pushy question here. But, you know, there's a lot of belief that the responsiveness of emissions in the transportation sector to a carbon price is limited, especially in the short run. So you put a carbon price, even if you put a high carbon price in place, a lot of people will argue that, you know, there's just not a lot of alternatives in the short run, so you just won't get that much behavioral change, whether it's personal drivers or whether it's trucks. But if we take the view that we're not trying to, you know, we're not looking for policy effects so much over 3 years or 5 years, but we're really designing policy to reduce emissions over the next 50 years. Yeah. Why can't we put in a carbon price? And, you know, if emissions only happen gradually in the first few years from transportation, but then they kick in a serious way over time, but meanwhile we're getting emissions reductions elsewhere, like why isn't that good enough? And Mark, you can respond to that, but then I'll let Diane take a shot at that too.
Right. So I would agree with you. If governments could be credible, that price would keep rising. So then I think the market would start to look at that and say, oh boy, you know, there's going to be a demand down the road for you know, electric or almost electric cars and more biofuel and possibly hydrogen. And so, I mean, I am going to sort of always answer that yes, if actually a carbon price by itself could do all of it. And then the problem is this nonlinearity in systems. And so I'll talk about it in two aspects. One, getting back to you, is, you know, are there options out there? I actually think the options are out there now. We now have electric cars. We've had electric cars for 20 years, but now we're commercializing more of them. But some of that's happened because jurisdictions didn't put a carbon price on. I argued for a carbon price to the Mulroney government in 88, 89, and they said, sure, after the next election. So we didn't do that for decade after decade. And what the Californians did is they put in what I'll call a niche market regulation. It said, we know we need these kind of ultra low and zero emission or partial emission vehicles. So we're going to put a niche regulation where we're forcing manufacturers, retailers of cars to sell a certain small percentage of the new technologies we know we'll need, because we're trying to get past this threshold where then carbon pricing, again, can be politically acceptable because it doesn't have to be so onerous, people have options. So that was one of them. But the other was, I did want to agree with Diane that, can you still hear me?
Oh, perfectly.
Yes.
Okay, good. We lost the screen here. But I wanted to agree with Diane, though. The other side of that is, so that's to do with the type of car you drive. Then when it comes to questions about, do I even drive a car? And I know I sounded like, oh, well, people will keep driving cars. But, you know, if we know this from looking at cities around the world, if you change urban form and the ease with which one can walk to work or take a bike or take transit, you really can affect the mode shift. You can't affect it hugely because the roads won't be empty. The roads in Copenhagen are not empty. The roads in New York or Paris are not empty. But you can get higher percentages of people having these other options. And so, those are levels, those are decisions at levels of government infrastructure planning and zoning, urban development, and so on. So those are public areas. They aren't just a carbon price out there.
So Diane, back to you, either responding to my question or to Mark's.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could probably respond to both of you. And when I look at as Mark, you identified, the niche regulation around low carbon fuel standards, and looking at the price of, in your report, Chris, identifying the high cost of carbon mechanisms that we've put in place. I think that, you know, when we look at all of the different opportunities to reduce emissions, I'm not sure that we as Canadians have made choices solely based on the price per ton. So if you look at what Ontario did and eliminated coal-fired electricity, I think that that's probably about $100 to $120 a ton to make that bold statement, right? So I think sometimes we make policies or we create subsidies or new regulations that stimulate a new area. That's traditionally the way that Canada has supported new development, new technology. And I think that in the case of biofuels, it did stimulate and send a clear message to alternative fuel developers to look at what the possibilities are, and biofuels is one. You can look at a whole range. So I think we need to recognize that in order to make significant environmental improvements, that, you know, least cost is not necessarily going to drive us to where we need to get to within the length of time that we need to get there.
So, okay, I love what you just said, because it just raises this huge issue. So when Mark was talking about his niche market regulations in California, I kind of wanted to ask, well, you know, has anybody estimated, you know, the costs associated with those policies, and then think about the cost effectiveness? I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but it led me then to write down, well, what is the measure of success when you're thinking about these policies, and to what extent should we actually think about the cost per ton? So Diane, you measured, you mentioned the coal phase out. I mean, our report is about biofuels. Our estimates are that biofuel policies reduced emissions, but did it at a very high price. So is it reasonable, I guess, what is the measure of success that we should be putting on various policies? Is it just emissions reductions? Is it the development of some key industry? Should we be actually guided mostly by a cost per ton measure? Or if not entirely, then what weight do we put on cost per ton measure? I mean, as an economist, especially one who's thinking about economic growth these days, I have a hard time justifying a policy that achieves its goals but does it at a very high cost if there is another way to achieve those goals. So, right. Mark and Diane, you want to go first?
I was just going to say, Mark. Chris, when have you not been thinking about economic growth?
Good point. Good point. Diane.
Yeah, I think that we, in my mind, I think we don't want to predetermine the outcome or build a scenario that is a short-term scenario. So while I think that looking at biofuels and second generation or third generation, I think we're still in our infancy with respect to how we're going to be moving forward with these opportunities. And so I think we want to make sure that we have a lens that is longer term and I think we need a number of sort of key performance indicators. So, yes, cost per ton, looking at increasing technology, introducing a new forms of businesses. And, if I reflect on another incentive that was put in place, which is similar to the biofuel subsidy, was the original wind power production incentive, which was introduced in 2002. At the time, we had about 200 megawatts of wind power in Canada. And we saw the sort of the overachievement of renewable energy. And so now today with wind capacity, we have over 11,000 megawatts, which is enough generation to support all of Saskatchewan and all of Manitoba. And you look at the economic impact of that industry, the kinds of manufacturing that has arrived in Ontario. And I think that, you know, in the transformation of the last 15 years, we've seen great success with respect to cleaning our electricity sources and minimizing the greenhouse gas impact.
Right. So I was going to ask a question about the Green Energy Act, but I was going to get into our next hangout, which is next week on subsidies. So, but I won't go there. So let me then come back to transportation specifically. Let's assume that we agree that we should try to reduce emissions specifically in transportation. And let's just suppose we take off the carbon price. So let's just assume that there is a carbon price in place. And in fact, in now most provinces in the country, soon you will start to see a carbon price slowly ramping up over time. So let me ask each of you for what's your number one favorite policy to reduce transportation emissions, and you get to choose which part of transportation you like, okay? What's your number one policy to reduce transportation emissions aside from the carbon price? And tell me why, kind of what's your measure of why you like it? Mark?
Okay, so when you said aside from the carbon tax, is the carbon tax happening or not?
Yeah,
or a carbon price?
No, sorry, good point. No, I'm going to assume that the carbon price is there. So, I mean, you can say we're in BC right now and the carbon price is $30, or you can say we're Ontario and it's 17, or you can say we're in some part of the province that doesn't have it yet, but it will soon now have it either federally or provincially, depending on how you think the world will unfold. But let's assume that there is a carbon price at $30 a ton, say, and it's going to gradually ramp up at some unspecified rate. Now, is there some other policy you want to put in place beside that?
Yeah, so if it was running up at a rate that I thought was consistent with some trade-off between what we call the social cost of carbon, and which is often keeps getting corrected upwards, that's some estimate of what is the real damages, and is way below the price that we would need, for example, to prevent 2C or greater increases in temperature. That price of carbon needs to be at almost, most of the models I've seen, it's got to get close to $300 by 2050. So we're talking about a price that really gets up high. So let's assume the price is not rising at the rate that I think it should. Then the kind of policies I'm interested in transportation, and this would apply, it would be the same kind of policy whether to freight road transport or via a personal vehicle, small vehicle road transport, and it would be what I described earlier. And it's a niche market regulation, and I'll just very quickly explain what I mean by that. And the reason is because I think it's the closest to what a rising carbon price would get. So some people say, let's have an electricity standard, so a ZEV standard, zero emission vehicle. People think that I'm associated with that sometimes, and I'm not. I hate that policy, because it says, let's pick a technology winner. Let's have people get electric cars. And I think we should never be certain that that's the way it'll unfold, because I remember in sort of the mid to late 90s, it was going to be electric cars. Then it was going to be hydrogen cars. Then it was biofuel, and then it was back to electric. And I really don't like economists like me or governments trying to guess what that will be, because it's an interplay of what consumers might want, anxiety about batteries, I don't know, and what industry finds it can make and market. And so what a niche market is in the way I like it, and California's is not quite right, is it says, here's a broad category of vehicles that are very close to low emission, and some of them are zero emission. And we are going to tell you, retailers of automobiles, you have to hit certain sales levels in these that are small initially and rising over time. And that gives information certainty for the manufacturers, and it allows them freedom, because it's not technology specific, to do innovation and marketing to see what's possible. It also allows them to trade among themselves, so that those who can do it more easily or cheaply might, Tesla might get credits from other people because of the sales that it's getting, whereas, I don't know, BMW would still be just doing gasoline cars. There are also benefits from these policies because, at least the bit that we've tried to detect in California, which has been the leader, again, not with perfect policies, is that there's even income effects from this. If I have to, as a manufacturer, in order to avoid a per car penalty by the regulator, I want to try to sell more of a certain kind of car, I've actually got to jack up the prices of all the luxury models, which have, people are less responsive to a higher price in order to subsidize the low emission cars I'm trying to sell, and so there's some interesting things between income groups with those kind of policies. So I'm just giving you a smattering, I don't want to go too long, of why that kind of policy could be close to the extreme innovative and dissemination of new technology effects that we would need to have and would get from a rapidly rising carbon price.
Okay, so I'm going to just, before I forget, I want to ask a question, but I'm going to go straight to Diane. But Mark, I want you to come back in 2 minutes and tell us if that policy that you just outlined, I mean, it sounded like it was not really performance-based, it was requiring a portfolio of technologies. So you can agree or disagree, but think about that in 2 minutes. Diane, you've got your favorite policy to go alongside a carbon price. What's your number one?
Well, if I think about what is available on the market today, but also the space that we need to be in the future, and look at how do we address emissions from the only subsector that's actually growing within the transportation sector, and that would be heavy-duty freight. And so looking at policies that support the type of fuel, the fuel efficiency. One of the ideas that we put forward in the Pan-Canadian discussions earlier this year was to have the federal government look at a national freight policy where we look at establishing alignment with regulations that are coming out from the US, greenhouse gas and fuel efficiency regulations, and also looking at low carbon fuel standards, which would allow the flexibility within a variety of different ways, opportunity to test out different technologies. So a low carbon fuel standard would be technology neutral. I think we need to marry that with looking at ways in which we can support the infrastructure for that. And so looking at, sort of highly active corridors. So for example, in Quebec and Ontario, we have the Windsor-Quebec City corridor along the 401 and Route 20 in Quebec, and looking at establishing a low carbon highway where we have various technologies and fueling infrastructure along there so that we can really advance a variety of different technologies.
Okay, low carbon fuel standard. By the way, you're not making a distinction here. This is a question between heavy duty on roads and heavy duty on rails. I mean, can you say everything that you just said, whether you're talking about either rail or road? Well,
I think when we're looking at diesel, it would apply to both rail as well as trucks. But if you're looking also, there's the opportunity to electrify our commuter rails, which is what Ontario is proposing to do with their RER program. So I think that it could apply to both rail and trucks.
Perfect. Okay, so Diane mentioned technology neutral as a low carbon fuel standard. So Mark, back to you for that very quick one. Was your recommendation of this kind of I thought it was requiring a portfolio of technologies. Is that technology neutral? It kind of sounds like it's not quite technology neutral.
Well, no, actually. It would be technology neutral, so it was not requiring a portfolio, and that's where I was going to come back at you.
Oh, okay.
So I've got no problem. So We don't know. It could be that in personal vehicles, it ends up being winner take all.
Right.
Just as we saw when the gasoline engine sort of made its way 100 years ago, 110 years ago, it had competition from other fuels and electricity even. And so it wouldn't surprise me in something like personal vehicles if that you'll end up, as you're moving to really low emission variants, that there'll be a shakeout. And it'll actually just be one thing that emerges, or maybe, for example, that just mostly electricity in urban personal transportation and maybe mostly biofuels in long distance freight transportation by trucks. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And I would not want to put in policies that prevented that shakeout from happening. So the niche market doesn't grow more than 10, 20%. It's to get those technologies in there where they can be competitive. And then you'd have to have something like either the rising low carbon fuel standards, so I agree with much of what Diane said, or the rising carbon price via cap and trade or even a carbon tax. So the niche market wasn't to determine what would be there after that major transition. It was really to get the ball rolling and get that innovation driving if we don't think that we can get a carbon price at that signal level that it needs.
Gotcha. Okay. Now I'm going to change gears and I'm going to ask for each of you to give us an example of a bad way to reduce emissions in the transportation sector. And again, you get to define what bad is. Bad might be costly, bad might be ineffective, bad might be politically crazy or politically non-durable for some reason. You know, whatever you mean by bad, you get to define it. So, Diane, and by the way, you get extra points in this. You get extra points if your bad example is a currently existing policy, so that some policymaker that's sitting out there listening to this gets to say, oh, either Mark or Diane think this is bad policy. Maybe we should take this off the books. Extra points if you've got policy chutzpah here. Okay, Diane.
Okay. Well, I think when it comes to transportation, really how we move ourselves around. So I think when I think about a bad way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think that we need to change the way we are or have historically built out our communities. And so making sure that the communities that we're building today are much more efficient, that we are building up. And so in increasing our density, or increasing our intensification within built up communities, but then also making sure that if we are building out, that those communities are far more dense than they were historically. And so it really is just looking at balancing transportation and land use management and making sure that we're not going to be an environment where we were 40 years ago, where people had a job. For example, my dad worked at Dofasco for 42 years and he lived in the same house all that time. And I think the way that we operate our commerce today, all of us are moving around. And so I think if you don't factor in transportation within official master plans and looking at making sure that we are best utilizing our transportation network.
Okay, so if we push for more densification in our cities and reducing urban sprawl, and let's suppose we do that over a long period of time, isn't one of the downsides of that kind of policy approach going to be that we have rising house prices? So Mark is Mark is right now in Ottawa, but normally he's in Vancouver. Diane, where are you normally residing?
Our offices are in Toronto, and I live in Port Credit, Mississauga. So
okay.
I'm a traditional 905er traveling in from outside the core.
But some people will argue that policies of that kind, which may be very good in an environmental sense, may have this other downside, which is that you're really restricting development around in these big cities in the suburbs, and that drives up house prices and creates the kinds of problems that we observe in Vancouver or Toronto or elsewhere. I just throw that out there. I mean,
Mhm.
do you think that's right to connect those two ideas?
I don't. I mean, I think what you want to be able to really factor in, I mean, is the full cost of buying a house, you know, in the outer skirts, and looking at, you know, as a family, you might have two cars, going from A to B. I think that, you know, when you want to be able to price in all of the different costs associated with travel. And so, you know, if you're moving closer to the city, you may not require two vehicles. You can, you know, easily access public transportation or make choices around cycling. I think there's a whole variety of factors that drive up the cost. I think creating communities where you have a mixed use of housing, whether it's high density. You know, I think we also want to look at reforming how we're building some of our condominiums. I mean, it's designed particularly in the downtown core for, you know, single people, one bedroom condos, which don't necessarily support, you know, families. And so I read an article, and I won't be able to source who this is from, but, you know, we're creating bedrooms for cars, but not for families and people. And so looking at mixed use opportunities, I think, will help.
You know, Diane, on an earlier conversation, you admitted almost apologetically that you were not an economist, yet you just gave a very eloquent defense of user fees. So I just want you to know that I think you are an economist at heart.
Okay.
That's a big compliment.
That's okay. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, it doesn't often come across that way, but it actually is. Okay, Mark, your favorite bad policy.
Fine, but I'll just respond first to the cost of living in Vancouver, and just because it's interesting. I mean, getting to be an older professor, I have younger colleagues. They move into Vancouver. They don't expect to have a single family dwelling with a large backyard. They expect to live as people might have who were at you know, at different universities around the world. So, you know, at Columbia University in Manhattan, that they expect to be in nice apartments, which the middle class in large urban centers have lived in. My own kids who are in their 20s say they don't expect to have a detached house like they grew up in, and they say, Dad, we're really happy about that because you were working on that thing all the time. And that's just, and they love Vancouver. Now, I mean, they're living in different places. Two of them are in Vancouver. And so it's for me, it's, yes, I guess I'm sounding like an economist, but if that's the value of living in that city, then so I don't say it got expensive. I say it's expensive if you want to have a single family house. So Vancouver is having densification in neighborhoods where it should be occurring. It's not far from downtown, like the Kitsilano area where I am. So anyway, sorry to go on that, but the bad policy, and yeah, you've set that up well, Chris, because I am going to say that that I think your eco-fiscal report is a really good contribution. And so again, just what you said in there was that, okay, so we're having renewable fuel mandates that require a certain percentage of ethanol in our gasoline and biodiesel in our diesel. And what are those really costing? Because there's both subsidies to their production in Canada, and then there's a higher cost of these, and the cost per ton might be quite high because actually the farming activity and the processing plants might actually have a lot of emissions. So what is the net reduction from burning corn-based ethanol? So there's two problems or concerns or possible worries I have, though, with your report. One is that the government would land onto that and say, okay, let's get rid of this thing. And they would not replace it simultaneously. So you and you're wiping out the industry, the processing plants, and that allocation of farm work that was, and also the delivery infrastructure for the biofuels. So I would really want, if one was to move away from that somewhat bad policy, you need to do it in a proper way. And the only other point I'd make is that I'm shocked at how often people will say things like, corn-based ethanol look at all these emissions it has. And so they basically say, you know, okay, George Bush and others put in policies like this, and they didn't care at all about greenhouse gas emissions. So they didn't tell processing plants that were built to make the fuel. You can't be burning coal to make this. They didn't say, you know, you ought to be using a lot of your own fuel. They didn't do what we do with organic farming, which would have been to say, hey, if you want to grow corn and it's to make canola for biodiesel, then the tractors on your farm in Saskatchewan have to run on biodiesel. So my own researchers, we've built a model now for if the policy was consistent and said, you know, produce, just like if you're going to have an electric car, how are you making the electricity? You're going to have biodiesel, how are you making the diesel? And we found that it wasn't a huge increase in production cost to make biodiesel without having all those upstream emissions. And so I'm not blaming you guys, but you didn't really probe that in your study. And so another possibility, instead of getting rid of that mandate, is to go upstream. But I admit I'm layering regulation on top of regulation, and the economist in me is already getting worried as I say that.
Good. Okay, thank you very much, both of you. We've got about 20 minutes left because we started, I think, at 1:05, so we've got about 20 minutes left. We got lots of questions from the audience. Maybe even some have come in the last 40 minutes. But let me, I was actually going to start with a set of questions that were about low carbon fuel standards and zero emission vehicle standards and performance-based standards, but I think we've kind of captured that. Like, I mean, Diana's talked about low carbon fuel standards and the need to be technology neutral. Mark has talked about the fact that he hates zero emission vehicle standards precisely because they're not technology neutral. You clearly, both of you seem to be in favor of policies that are flexible, that are performance-based, that, as Mark would say, kind of come close to replicating what a carbon price could do in terms of its flexibility. So do you guys want to say, like, 30 seconds each, either yes or no? Did I capture your agreement appropriately? Mark's happy. Diane's happy. We're moving on.
And Mark gets his bonus points.
Mark gets his bonus. Okay.
I know how to play this game.
Do we need to say anything specific about rail? So maybe come back to Diane's comment about, her opening comment about, you know, it was connected to trade. A lot of trade is about the, you know, the movement of goods to and from ports or to and from tidewater in some way. You know, there is a lot of rail transportation used there. Do we need to say anything specific about rail, or does a low carbon fuel standard get us there? Okay, so I'm going to ask for quick responses on this. Mark.
Yeah, so when I talk about different kinds of policies, I'm interested in how many players there are in a particular, so this is all the people buying cars, you know, but this is, oh, the rail companies, you know, or the electricity companies. So while of course I'd rather not be going sector by sector through the economy, the experience of the last decades has told me that that's probably what you kind of got to do. So I think even with global shipping, or we're talking airlines these days, that we'll, you know, be trying to get these sector by sector international agreements that have a performance standard aspect to them and try to move us onto those lower carbon trajectories technologically. And when it comes to rail, there are less players to play with. And so I don't really, just as we've been doing with electricity in Ontario, okay, it's easy, it was publicly owned, but even in Alberta now they're talking about, or Nova Scotia, you know, or how we're phasing out coal plants. And I think that when it comes to rail, again, it's something where government can kind of step in with the key players and say, I'm sorry, we need this to go down. We'll call it performance-based because we don't want to tell you what technology. Maybe this hydrogenated derived renewable diesel, it's called HDRD, and it can be blended in any amount into regular diesel. So there's an example where you said to trains, you guys, you want to go to hydrogen? Fine. You want to do it gradual by blending in a biodiesel? Fine. But on a performance standard, you know, per weight, per ton kilometer transported, that's the unit in our model, this has to go down. And so that, and you know, you got a few players to deal with. So
just to be clear, you would be doing that on top of or beside a carbon price, And the logic then is the carbon price is going to drive some reductions, but this sort of flexible regulation is going to drive extra reductions, but also in a relatively cost-effective way.
Yes, if I saw that politically the carbon price, we still couldn't get it as high, so we were involved in this sector by sector, blah, 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 then, and in that basis, which you guys did in your study, and we always do, is we try to estimate what is the dollar cost of what I'll call the implicit carbon price of that particular kind of performance standard.
Okay, perfect. Diane, railways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we'd want to understand when you say railways, whether that's moving goods and services, or are we talking about commuter rail? And I think that there's an opportunity from a commuter rail perspective to look at electrifying, improving the services, as is Metrolinx considering. I know in Vancouver, so there is, and also in Calgary, looking at light rail transit and electrifying that. So it's transit and rapid regional rail. So I think there's great opportunity to really, it depends on, again, where the electricity is coming from. In Ontario, we'd have significant wins there if we move away from diesel and electrify. When we're looking at the movement of goods, yes, Mark, you made a good point around, the type of fuel used in the rails themselves, but looking at integrating rail as a mechanism to improve the efficiency of transporting the goods. And so it's my understanding through the Rail Association that moving on a per kilometer basis, moving rail is more efficient than by truck. And so I think, if provinces are looking at the movement of goods, I think rail is an important component of that, and looking at the multimodal opportunities in which we can more efficiently move our goods. And so if it means moving some goods off of our highways and sort of moving it to rail, or just looking at how we might be able to move our goods around, I think there's opportunities from regulation on the fuel themselves, but also the efficiency in which how we move goods.
Perfect. Okay.
And Chris, can I just jump in for a sec? And so, I agree with much of what Diane is saying, but from my own research, I guess, and maybe I've said that in my earlier comments, mode shifting may have bigger welfare costs for people, and even value costs for private companies. In other words, what is the sort of surplus or extra value associated with a truck and its convenience relative to rail? And I just point that out because often I will run into, and not Diane, but just people they could be academic, engineers, sometimes environmentalists, who will come out and say, oh, look at this. Rail is less emissions per ton kilometer transported, and absolutely true. And therefore, let's just shift stuff over to rail from trucks. And in fact, when we do research on the trucking industry, they will say these are not substitutes. They look like they're transporting kilometers traveled of freight, but they're not substitutes. And the same thing goes on the human side when cars versus public transit. And I just point that out, that we have to be sensitive to that. And I think Diane would agree with me.
I definitely agree.
The question about railways came from Michael, and in fact, Michael in Ontario, and he asked something almost exactly that, right? If 10% of truck traffic were transferred to rail, Canada would benefit from those reductions. So it's exactly your point, Mark, on that these things are not perfect substitutes. They may be poor substitutes, but they're certainly not perfect substitutes. And some of the things are probably not substitutable at all. Okay, I was going to ask a question from Adrienne in Ontario, but I'm now not going to. She asked this great, she asked a question about, do you think government should pick one type of low carbon vehicle to support? I'm going to predict that you're both going to say no.
No.
Sorry, but no.
Okay, Adrienne, there's your answer. No. Okay, Lynn in BC. This is a great question, and it's a tough one, I think. How can rural and northern communities incorporate a clean shift in transportation and energy infrastructure without breaking the bank, theirs or Ottawa's? or for that matter, a provincial capital, okay? Northern and rural communities, if we have a special conversation about train, can we have a special conversation about rural communities? Maybe we don't need to. Mark, quick one.
Well, I can answer really quickly because I think I've already answered it. I've run into this all the time, this assumption that we're going to address this by people getting on buses and out of their pickup trucks and so on. And so even when we were bringing the carbon tax in British Columbia, I had to work to help the government address these issues with northern communities and rural communities and say, actually, you'll probably still use a vehicle. And so we need to have policies that make sure that that vehicle is running on biodiesel or whatever. And so I don't see any particular disadvantage to non-urban communities in a move to reduce greenhouse gases and transportation. I think it's a myth.
Right, except that in the short run, they would pay a higher fuel cost until they then switch over either with a converted vehicle or to a new vehicle. It might take them a year or 2 years or 5 years before that transition takes place, right? And then it starts changing their behavior.
But very few of the urbanites will be switching. All of our studies show they'll all still be in cars.
Right.
They'll all still
right. So, but this gets back to the original point that not much substitution is going to happen in a year or 2 or 3, but a lot might happen over 5 or 10 or 20.
Right. But I don't even think that'll happen in terms of mode shifting, and that's the only difference between a rural area and an urban area.
Right. But fair enough. They'll still be in their truck, but they will be burning different fuel, and their truck will be more fuel efficient. Both of those things will probably be true. Diane, anything on that?
Yeah, no, I think Mark summarized it, and I think it is difficult to introduce transit into rural areas where you don't have the ridership, and so I don't have much to add beyond what Mark had said.
Okay, so a bunch of questions here about the personal vehicle and our individual's commitment to the vehicle, to the car. In fact, I have a question here from Doug in Alberta. Now, I have a brother Doug in Alberta, so I don't know if this is him. There's probably more than one Doug in Alberta, but this might be my brother. And he says, many people are driving highly inefficient four-wheel drive pickups. How can we get them out of their vehicles without starting a rebellion? And no, I absolutely do not believe the price of fuel alone will do it. Actually, it might be my brother. But, but I'm thinking that your answer to this is, Mark, we may not get you out of the vehicle. The vehicle might change. It might burn different fuel. It's going to happen over time. But the car is a beautiful thing, and we're going to keep using it.
Yep, and my research, boy, we've probed this question, and we tried to do it in a really academically sound way, and there's a lot of sort of surveys that are really questionable. So we've tried to do this in ways that gets published in top journals, and we find there's a real value to a personal mobility device, or we even call it a personal mobility status enhancing device, or personal mobility sexually...
Could you repeat that? That's a terribly academic term. Could you repeat that, please?
It's called a PMSED, Personal Mobility and Status Enhancing Device.
Otherwise known as a car.
Or a pickup truck.
A fast car that's maybe red and a rag top.
Arnold Schwarzenegger got it. When he started going aggressively on climate policy in California, he converted one of his Hummers to biofuel. And he converted another Hummer to hydrogen. Now, I don't know how many Hummers he has, and he would go and hang out with car people in Los Angeles. And he said to them, look, our policies are not going to threaten you guys. You like toys? You just can't wreck the planet. That's all.
Okay. Diane, you want to add anything?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think when we look at the stats around, the personal mobility, for the last 3 years in Canada, we have got record sales of new vehicles, and the ratio of that, the cars are going down and SUVs are going up. And so I don't see us sort of transitioning out of the individual car and the kind of car that we're all choosing to drive. And so again, I'm with Mark on this. I think that they will remain. I think that if you look at other costs, you might start to see more people getting out of whatever vehicle they're in. So if you're looking at, congested cities like Toronto, where we think that there's opportunities for charging to be on the road, looking at the high occupancy vehicle lanes or toll lanes. And so I think fuel alone will not get us out of the vehicle, but I think if you have some additive expenses of driving your car around, I think that will minimize it, but it certainly won't change in the near term.
And I just want to add there that I agree with everything Diane said, and so I'm not saying that car ownership won't go down in the center of city, in Vancouver and Toronto, and especially because of cost and because of convenience. And so absolutely that will happen. But I agree completely.
It probably already is happening. I haven't seen the stats on this, but when you have these things like Car2Go and Communauto and things like this, which if you're an urban dweller, I mean, these are just a fabulous substitute to owning a car and all of the hassle that goes with a car. And it's not fundamentally environmental policy that's driving that. It's not even policy necessarily that's driving that. It's a market response to a very real situation. Final comment on cars, and I don't mean for this to be an advertisement, but the idea of staying in a car strikes me as realistic, staying in cars, especially after you've driven something like a Tesla. So I don't know if you've driven a Tesla. So I've never driven one, but I've been a passenger twice, and it is just the coolest vehicle. It's like a rocket that is silent, and it is. So if that thing can, come down in price, as it will over time, that can be a pretty fabulous substitute. One last question. We've got 4 minutes to go, and this is not a small question. Alex in Ontario asks the question, what role do you see for social movements in driving reductions in Canada's transportation emissions? Social movements. We'll start with Diane.
Oh. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, no problem. No problem.
Yeah. No, I think that, we're seeing a lot of social movement here in Toronto with respect to car ownership. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for us to reframe the conversation and look at, I think we've seen millennials making choices in not having car ownership. You've got disruptive services that are coming in, Uber and Lyft and BlankRide and others that I think there's less and less interest by millennials to have that ownership, right? And so, and then just the availability of other opportunities. Car share, you mentioned, Chris. We've got bike share programs here in the city as well. And so you've got the opportunity and to reframe the conversation. I mean, we've had kind of this 100-year relationship with the personal vehicle. And I think the social movement has, especially with the way that, the municipalities, the City of Toronto is reshaping the conversation, looking at the public realm and the value around, creating these very livable, comfortable communities. And so I think that the social movement will have a big part of how, our younger generation will move forward.
Perfect.
And I can add very briefly just that my point would be more that, over the last 25, 30 years, we've looked at what thing might happen outside of hard-nosed climate policy that might work in the right direction for emissions reductions. It used to be peak oil. We're going to have peak oil, and it's a great one for government. We don't have to do anything. So sure, there will be social movements that maybe will have people spending less of their income on a vehicle, at least in urban centers, and on a vehicle and on the operation cost of that vehicle. And then maybe they'll spend more of that on traveling in jet airplanes. So my point is, these social movements are very hard to control, and we shouldn't assume that government has an ability to influence these things in any big way. As Diane and I talked about earlier, urban urban form, and can have an effect. So that is governments determining how many bike paths and how close you are to possibility to work and so on, and transit, of course. And so those are important. But the social movement itself is something that I just don't think governments will be very good at reining in the direction they want.
Right. But I mean, if I were to, if you were to go back to 1776 and ask Adam Smith to answer this question, he'd say, well, social movements are crucial, but social movements through marketplaces, right? I mean, market prices in Adam Smith's view are all about providing order or organization to what would otherwise be a fair amount of chaos, and getting the prices right. So coming back to carbon pricing, right? I mean, my beef with social movements in this direction is that the social movement is great, but it'd be also great if that social movement was combined with getting the prices right, because those two forces together will move the world, and they'll move it in the right direction. They could move it in the wrong direction if you get the prices wrong. So you got to channel a little bit of Adam Smith and a little bit of Bob Barker from The Price is Right, and get those two together, and your social movement will do what you need it to do. We are out of time. So I need to stop right now. Thank you, Mark Jackard and Diane Zimmerman. Thank you very much for talking about all this stuff, for answering these questions. The goal, as I said at the beginning, the goal is for EcoFiscal to be helping these conversations take place across the country. The nice thing about these Google Hangouts is that these things get recorded. So we have the participation that we've seen, but these things get recorded so that people can watch them after the fact. I think we had something like 220 people or 230 people out there. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope that you found this useful. And on that note, I will thank you all and say good day.
Good day.
Good day.
At some point,
Thank you.
Live
Thank
to
you.
off air. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
You're welcome.